We're moving into, who's the President of the United States, Talon?
Oh, you wouldn't know, you weren't here.
Who is the President of the United States, Megan? William McKinley. And during the early stages of William McKinley's administration, we're going to have trouble in Cuba. Now, as I mentioned to you yesterday, Cuba is not what we would consider a friendly ally at this time. It has been for a long time a communist country that we have despised, that has been just 90 miles from Key West, Florida. So it's been kind of an issue. And Cuba is the country that led to us in the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 60s, almost brought us to the brink of nuclear war. So it's an interesting story that we start like this. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, Spain's once mighty empire in the New World had been shattered to only two countries. They still have ties to Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico. Those islands are in the Caribbean Sea. Now in 1868, well before McKinley was elected president, a very violent revolution broke out in Cuba. What's a revolution, Shania? Okay, the revolution is the country. Who's the country? The people revolt against the what? Government. And it took Spain 10 years to crush that uprising. So in 1868, the people of Cuba revolted against the government, and it took the government of Spain 10 years to beat that back. That's a long time. Well, even though they beat back the revolution, discontent continued in Cuba. They were tired of working. The people were tired of working for starvation wages for extremely wealthy landowners. It was a horrible situation. The people were treated badly. These wealthy landowners were having these people work for what they considered starvation wages. So because of that, in 1895, what did they do? Revolted again. So in 1895, because of the continued poor treatment of Cuban citizens, they rose up and revolted again in 1895. Well, the Spaniards responded to this revolution by putting Cubans into concentration camps. Obviously, they treated them very poorly. Large areas of Cuba were reduced to just utter ruin. Starvation, disease plagued the land. They just treated these people horribly and didn't do anything to make their life better because they were mad that they revolted again. So they took this revolution down. They just treated him terrible. They didn't try to even work with him. Okay? Well, Americans are thinking, this kind of reminds us of the American Revolution when we didn't feel like we were treated fairly. Maybe not to that extent, but they thought about their own struggles for freedom during what they turned out to make the American Revolution. So America's got interested. And there were two American newspapers that really sympathized with the Cubans. And when you get the media involved, things start to happen. So there were two American newspapers that really sympathized with the Cubans. And these two newspapers were two of the most famous newspapers at the time in our country, the New York Journal and the New York World. They were very, very important newspapers in our country at the time. And they both became very sympathetic to the Cuban cause because they felt bad they were treated so poorly. They were starving. They were put in concentration camps. They were beaten. They were treated as less than last-class citizens, so to speak. Well, as the media continued to fuel this fire, many people in the United States insisted that America had the moral responsibility to help restore order in Cuba and help those people out. We have a reputation for doing that. America always tries to make countries that are suffering better under tyrants. And it was no different in Cuba. So many people in the United States, mostly because of the fuel that was being fired by the two big newspapers, felt like our country had the moral responsibility of trying to restore order in Cuba. Well, William McKinley, when he was inaugurated in as president, he actually strongly opposed any war. He did not want to get into a war with Spain over Cuba. And he made that pretty clear. Well, who went after him? Who? The press, yeah. The New York Journal and the New York World, among other newspapers, were eager to criticize him. And what they did on February 9th of 1898, pretty short order after his inauguration, on February 9th of 1898, one American newspaper headlined a letter that was written by the Spanish minister to the United States. Okay, so on February 9th, American newspapers were happy to headline a letter that was written by the Spanish minister to the United States. And this really doesn't have anything to do with Cuba, but it's going to affect relationships between the United States and Spain. Okay? What do you think this American minister to the United States, now that's someone that lives in the United States, that talks for his country within our country to the administration. What do you think was the contents of that letter? You know, not specifically, but overall, what do you think that letter did that was published freely by the press? What do you think that letter stated about President McKinley? Good or bad?
Coward.
What's that? Yeah, it didn't have anything to do with Cuba, if you think about it, but it did have to do with relationships. So in the letter, the Spanish minister of the United States referred to President McKinley as he was weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd. Think about what that says. He said McKinley was weak and a bidder for the admiration of the crowd. He was weak and a bidder, B-I-D-D-E-R, for the admiration of the crowd. Pretty easy to figure out that when he says he's weak, he's weak. He's calling him a weak person. But when he calls him a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, what does that mean, Gracie? He's a bidder for the admiration of the crowd. When you bid on something, you try to do what? Buy it or win it, win a bid. So if he's the bidder for the admiration of the crowd, what is he? He's what?
He's only there to, like, basically give them what they want.
Pretty much, yeah. He wants everybody to like him. You know, I'll give you an example. If you want to be a disciplinarian in a school, the chances are you can't, everybody's not going to like you. You're going to make some people mad. So if you are bothered by making people mad, you're not going to probably be a disciplinarian, assistant principal, because people are going to be mad at you. If you're a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, you're trying to make everybody happy. You're trying to please everybody. You're not yourself. You're kind of phony.
But
Yes?
as a president, isn't that kind of your job, is to do what the people want?
Yeah, but not necessarily the crowd. That's a good point, but the people are different than the crowd. So you got a crowd over here that wants you to persecute Cubans, and you want a crowd over here that all are American citizens that want you to save the Cubans. You can't bid for the admiration of each group. You know what I mean? You have to make a decision on what you're going to do. Well, when that comment came out in the papers, tension mounted between the two countries. And that's what the media was trying to do, right? Because what were they trying to improve the relations with Spain? No, they were trying to make it a little bit tense so maybe McKinley would get off his duff and help with Cuba. Well, on February 16, 1898, the fuse that was lit by these articles exploded. Okay? And that takes us to our next subtopic, which is the sinking of the USS Maine. So again, the tension mounted between the two countries, and it all exploded on February 16, 1898, which is our next subtopic, the sinking of the USS Maine. Now, did we have Americans and American property around Cuba? Sure we did. Everybody has a presence. Well, on February 15th, the day before I mentioned, on February 15th of 1898, an American battleship called the USS Maine was stationed in Havana Harbor in Cuba. It was stationed in Havana Harbor in Cuba. Why was that battleship sent to Cuba? Why did it sit in Havana Harbor? To do what? Protect Cubans? Protect American lives and property that were in and around that island, because we had people there. And tensions have gotten worse. So the battleship was sent there to the harbor to make sure that Americans in Cuba and property around Cuba was protected. Well, unbelievably, as it might seem, early in the morning on February 16th, there was an explosion of unknown origin on the battleship Maine. There was an explosion of unknown origin on the battleship Maine while it was docked in Havana Harbor in Cuba. That happened suddenly the morning of February 16th. That explosion caused major damage, and the battleship sank to the bottom of Havana Harbor. Battleship sank to the bottom of Havana Harbor. And what resulted in the sinking of that ship, which ended up at the bottom of Havana Harbor?
Accusations.
Well, before that. That's before the accusations. What? Well, before that. What would cause accusations in war? Do you think they cared if the boat was at the bottom of the harbor? Probably bothered them, but what else was at the bottom? 260 American sailors were also at the bottom of Havana Harbor, dead. So that was the big deal. So the battleship sank to the bottom of Havana Harbor. The problem wasn't just the battleship sinking. 260 American sailors perished as a result. And there was no doubt in the minds of Americans that that was not done by Americans. It was done by Spanish people in Cuba. So when the news reached the United States, Americans were demanding war. I mean, demanding. It's not like today where you have a terrorist attack and we kind of wuss around things. I mean, in those days, you kicked ass and took names. Somebody sinks a battleship and kills 260 American sailors, there's going to be hell to pay. And Americans were demanding war, all chanting, "Remember the Maine! Remember the Maine!" So who's getting tremendous pressure to act now? President McKinley. So when news reached the United States, Americans were demanding war, chanting the famous line, "Remember the Maine." Now this is kind of cool. When we go to Arlington next year, we're going to go to Arlington Cemetery, and we're going to go to the amphitheater, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and just on the other side of the amphitheater, which is just on the other side of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, is the mast, original mast from the battleship Maine. And you'll get a chance to see that. It'll be pretty cool. Okay, well, that takes us to our next subtopic then, which is the United States goes to war with Spain. The United States goes to war with Spain. Now, you don't have to write this down, but it's pretty obvious. You know, President McKinley was able to avoid war with Spain for almost 2 months after his inauguration. But the sinking of the Maine put so much pressure on him, he had no choice. So on April 11th of 1898, April 11th of 1898, the United States officially declared war on the country of Spain. And who has to do that? Who is the formal declaration of war made by?
Congress.
Congress, the House and the Senate. Okay, so on April 11th, 1898, the United States of America officially declared war on the country of Spain. Now, foreign countries right away thought, the United States, I got to question this a little bit. They must have some alternative motive for this thing. Why do you think, what do you think foreign countries, why do they think we went to war with Spain? Because they sunk the battleship Maine, killing 260 American sailors? Why were we going to war with them?
Land.
What land? We wanted Cuba. So there was a lot of thought among countries that the reason that the United States had declared war on Spain wasn't so much over the sinking of the battleship Maine and the loss of 260 American sailors' lives, but that the United States was interested in claiming Cuba for their own. Okay? Well, that really wasn't our intention, but we had to convince these foreign countries, because we need their support in this endeavor, that these thoughts were unwarranted. So a senator by the name of Henry Teller of Colorado introduced a resolution to Congress to try to calm this concern by foreign countries. So we did not have any intentions on Cuba at the time, and we felt like as a country we needed to make sure that other foreign countries believed that we did not, because we need their support. Not so much to fight the war, but to what? To wage it, to be able to do it. You got to have some support. And so Senator Henry Teller of Colorado sent a resolution to Congress which became known in American history as the Teller Amendment. Okay, the Teller Amendment was initiated by Senator Henry Teller of Colorado. It was a resolution sent to Congress to try to clear the air on our intentions in the Spanish-American War. And the Teller Amendment stated the following two things. Now he sent this to Congress. What does Congress have to do though? Approve it. So he sent this in. And what the Teller Amendment stated was, number one, that the United States would claim no rule over Cuba. The United States would claim no rule over Cuba. So that kind of sets up the second thing it said, is it said once the island of Cuba was free of Spanish rule, what would the United States do? Leave. Because are they going to fight in Cuba to free it? Right? So what the Teller Amendment stated was, number one, that the United States would claim no rule over Cuba. In other words, after the Spanish-American War was over, they would not claim Cuba as part of the United States. And they also stated, since they're fighting on Cuban soil, that once the island was free of Spanish rule, we would leave, and leave the country to the free people, so to speak, okay? Well, Congress took a look at that. How long did it take them to adopt it?
1 week.
Just like that, because they wanted it clear to foreign countries that we were not going to conquer Cuba for the United States as a possession. Okay, we were only trying to free it from tyranny. Okay, tyranny. All right. So that's what it did. And it was a very good move on Henry Teller's position. It was a good move to make. Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is kind of odd: battle in the Philippines, not Cuba. Battle in the Philippines, not Cuba. Where's the Philippines from Cuba? Here's Cuba. We're not going to get down here. Let's see here. No, we're not going to get down far enough. But Cuba's in this area here. Where are the Philippines? Other side of the world by what? Well, Japan, China, and that area. Okay? So the first military action of the Spanish-American War is not going to be in Cuba. It's going to be in the Philippines. And we'll explain why. Who owned the Philippines?
China.
Spain, and they had owned it. They had owned the Philippines since the days of Ferdinand Magellan. I mean, you guys that took, the world history should know who Ferdinand Magellan is, right? What did he do? He was a Spaniard that did what? Traveled where? All the way around the world, and he claimed all kinds of land when he did that, including the Philippines. So Spain had owned the Philippines clear back to Magellan. That's a long time, from Magellan to basically 1898. Well, the people in the Philippines didn't feel any different than the people in Cuba about the Spanish government. So there was one man who hoped to gain control of these islands, and it was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Wait, so
Go
they were
ahead.
being treated bad too, or like what?
What's that?
They were being treated bad too?
Yeah, they had no more liking for Spanish rule than Cuba did. And so there was a man, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, that was hoping to conquer the Philippines too. Anybody know who that Assistant Secretary of the Navy was? Theodore Roosevelt. Very good. Theodore Roosevelt. So, as we're looking at Cuba, Roosevelt, the Assistant Secretary of War, is looking at the bigger picture, and he says, hey, there's the Philippines over there. Those people aren't any happier than the people in Cuba. Let's free them too. But the different intention. Roosevelt wanted the Philippines. Why? Why do you want the Philippine Islands?
Nice military.
For what? You're right. What do you want to put there? Naval bases. Thank God he did later on, right? We'll talk about that next year. But Roosevelt had his eyes on the Philippines because he could see them as future naval bases for the United States. Okay? So the first skirmish of the Spanish-American War is going to be in the Philippines. Now what Roosevelt does is he orders U.S. Naval Commander George Dewey to advance to Manila. What's Manila? Capital of the Philippines. So when Roosevelt gets the go-ahead from McKinley to do this, he sends word to U.S. Naval Commander George Dewey, and he tells him to advance immediately to Manila, which was the capital of the Philippines. Advance immediately to Manila, the capital of the Philippines. What was at Manila that was so important was the Spanish fleet was stationed there. The major Spanish fleet was stationed there. They were stationed there for the same reasons that Roosevelt wanted the Philippines for his naval bases, so he could have some control over in the east. Well, American Navy vessels were modern. The Spanish Navy was weak and old, and they were no match. And Commander Dewey completed his orders with ease. The American naval vessels sank the Spanish fleet to the bottom of Manila Bay, just like that. Just didn't take any effort at all. So again, Commander Dewey took his more modern Navy. He completed his orders that he got from Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, and the American Navy sank the Spanish fleet to the bottom of Manila Bay in short order. And Admiral Dewey became a big-time hero because what he had done, this battle at Manila, had secured naval bases for the United States that they had cherished forever. Okay, so that's the story there. But we're really not in a war yet with Cuba. We just went over and took the Philippines about that quick. Well, that takes us to our next